Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. Alejandro Verdier, Deputy Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations, Under-Secretary General Mrs. Virginia Gamba, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A warm welcome also to our guest panelist, Honorable Emile Beatrice Epai, President of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus in the Central African Republic, and Mrs. Amanda Nguyen, CEO and founder of RISE, a non-governmental civil rights organization. Thank you all for gathering here today to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. With widespread sexual violence still a devastating reality in many conflicts around the world, this annual commemoration is an opportunity not only to raise awareness of the need to end conflict-related sexual violence, but also to stand in solidarity with and pay homage to the survivors, women, girls, men, and boys, who, despite the horrors they have endured, show the determination, resolve, and unflinching courage to stand up and speak out against this scourge. In 2015, when the General Assembly proclaimed the 19th of June as the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, following the visionary leadership of Argentina, it reminded us that the plight of all survivors should be the moral compass that guides our actions. Indeed, since my first day in office, I have emphasized the importance of a survivor-centered approach and made it a strategic priority of my mandate. What does a survivor-centered approach really mean? First and foremost, it is an approach that seeks to empower survivors by prioritizing their rights, needs, and wishes. It means treating survivors with dignity and respect, and ensuring that they have access to high-quality, multi-sectoral services in conditions of safety and confidentiality, including medical care, sexual and reproductive health care, psychosocial support, economic assistance, legal advice, and access to justice. It also means enabling survivors to seek justice and reparations, another critical component of a comprehensive response. In fact, reparative justice is the intervention that survivors want most, yet receive least. As victims of sexual violence are often rejected by their families and cast out of their communities, reparations is an essential step towards rebuilding their lives and livelihoods. Yet, over the past 2 years, my field missions have consistently revealed major gaps in service delivery and resources for survivors. When I visited Iraq, for example, I noted that specialized interventions for post-traumatic stress disorder were almost inexistent. I met with Yazidi survivors of brutal sexual slavery who had received no medical or psychosocial support 3 months after their release from Daesh captivity. Some of these women and girls were in a semi-comatose state. Others were suicidal. And what was the response? At best, only basic psychosocial first aid was available to them. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, survivors of sexual violence told me how they could never truly have physical security without economic security. I learned from these survivors, most of whom had been rejected by their families, how economic support bolsters their self-esteem, fosters their resilience and self-sufficiency, reduces their exposure to risk, and increases their perceived worth and value in the eyes of their community. During my field missions, I also noted how in many areas of conflict, where rape is used as a tactic of war and terror alongside bullets, bombs, and blades, that victims face stigma and discrimination not only from their families and communities, but at times also from first responders. I vividly recall the words of a young survivor in Maiduguri, Nigeria, who had been released from the grip of Boko Haram after a grueling 15 months in captivity. Having survived this ordeal, in the camp, she was then raped by a member of the Civilian Joint Task Force, a group of local militants operating in support of the Nigerian security forces. And this rape happened while she was collecting firewood outside of the camp. And she recounted to me how she was repeatedly questioned by a healthcare provider even before receiving treatment. She was asked, "Why did you leave the camp to collect firewood? Why did you go out alone? Why did you not fight harder or scream louder?" And during many more field missions, I learned how victim blame and other judgmental attitudes from medical personnel, police officers, and judicial authorities are commonplace. This unfortunately contributes to the chronic underreporting of these crimes and to the silence that shields the perpetrators and further isolates the victims. In the camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, I saw how journalists and certain NGOs insisted that women and girls tell their stories of rape in great detail, sometimes producing reports that even reveal the identity of the survivor. In their desperate search for solutions and justice, some women and girls agreed to provide testimony without fully understanding how it would be used or the risk it might entail. Both Rohingya women in Bangladesh and Yazidi women in Iraq told me that they had been interviewed so frequently and by so many actors, they could not always distinguish between humanitarian service providers, journalists, NGO workers, and academic researchers. In addition to the fact that repeated interviewing can trigger re-traumatization, raise expectations, and add to survivor frustration when justice remains elusive, it can also render the evidence inadmissible in court. And this is because the manner in which it was collected often falls short of legal standards, and because victim and witness accounts can easily be discredited by even the slightest inconsistencies between the multiple interviews on record. Conversely, a survivor-centered approach, a rights-based response, requires that all efforts to document, investigate, and address conflict-related sexual violence are well-coordinated, safe, confidential, based on informed consent, and include referral pathways to services and support. Such efforts must also guard against and minimize the risk of re-traumatization, social ostracism, and reprisals. My recent visit to the Central African Republic was yet another haunting reminder of what is at stake if we fail to pursue a survivor-centered approach. In the locations I visited, countless victims continue to be left behind due to severely constrained resources, collapsed institutions, and prevailing insecurity in territories controlled or occupied by armed groups. What does a survivor-centered approach mean to someone who has to walk for several days to reach the most basic healthcare facility? When it comes to post-rape care, we know that distance can be a matter of life or death, as HIV, post-exposure prophylaxis, and emergency contraception are most effective only within 72 hours of the incident. And in this respect, I'm glad that Honorable Epai, whom I met in Bangui, has accepted my invitation to share her perspectives on this subject. When we speak of a survivor-centered approach, we must also remember that survivors are not a homogeneous group. Sexual violence has many victims: women, girls, men, and boys. The fact that men are targets of sexual violence is often shrouded in shame, stigma, and stereotypes around masculine invulnerability. This means that male victims have been largely ignored and their needs left unmet. Other vulnerable groups that risk remaining invisible include rural women living in remote and isolated areas, ethnic minorities, indigenous women, widows, female heads of household, women's human rights defenders, journalists who report on sexual violence, children born of wartime rape who are often shunned as children of the enemy, forced wives and captives of terrorist and violent extremist groups who are often viewed as affiliates rather than victims, and members of LGBTI communities who have been targeted on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. All survivors have a right to tailored assistance that meets their specific needs without discrimination or adverse distinction on any ground. Ladies and gentlemen, over a decade since the issue of conflict-related sexual violence was elevated onto the Security Council agenda, the United Nations system is reaching and supporting thousands of survivors who had once been invisible and inaccessible. Dramatic, normative, institutional, and operational progress has been made. The two operational arms of my mandate, namely the interagency network UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict and the team of experts on the rule of law, are supporting survivors through projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iraq, DRC, South Sudan, and elsewhere. Moreover, in April, the fifth in a robust series of Security Council resolutions was adopted, Resolution 2467, which calls for a holistic, survivor-centered approach in both the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to end by emphasizing that a survivor-centered approach is one that gives voice and choice to the survivors, restores their agency, builds their resilience, and enshrines their experience on the historical record. At the same time, it should deprive the perpetrators of their liberty and means of doing harm. By shifting power dynamics in this way, a survivor-centered approach can also be a profoundly transformative approach that reaffirms the status of the survivor as a holder of rights that will henceforth be respected and enforced. While I have visited many diverse, war-torn corners of the world, the survivors I have met with consistently demand two things above all else. Firstly, that the perpetrators be brought to justice, and secondly, that they be provided with the means to support themselves and their families. If the survivor is truly to be at the center of our response, these demands must be heard and heeded. Thank you.